On the evening of July 18, 2024, a 911 call was placed from a residential neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio. The caller, a woman in distress, informed the dispatcher that a shooting had occurred outside her home. The woman described a confrontation between her husband, 38-year-old Mark Fields, and another woman who had been shot. The dispatcher quickly asked for details, but the caller, sounding increasingly panicked, was unable to provide much information. Police and paramedics were immediately dispatched to the scene. When authorities arrived, they found 29-year-old Casey Taylor lying in the front yard, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. Despite the quick arrival of paramedics, Casey was declared dead shortly after being transported to the hospital. She had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the abdomen, both wounds fatal. At the scene, Mark Fields was found standing nearby, holding a firearm. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, which struck the responding officers as unusual. Inside the house, Mark's wife, Lisa, and their two children, ages 8 and 10, were unaware of the violent event unfolding just outside their door. Lisa had been in the kitchen preparing dinner when the confrontation took place. Mark had successfully kept the affair and the secret relationship with Casey hidden from his family. Inside the home, life seemed as it always had, normal and uneventful. Outside, however, Mark's actions were about to expose the double life he had been leading for years. Police quickly secured the area, and Mark was placed under arrest without resistance. He was questioned at the scene, initially claiming that the shooting was the result of a heated argument that had escalated uncontrollably. He insisted that Casey had been the one to confront him outside, accusing him of betraying her, and that he had acted in self-defense. However, his story raised several questions, as no evidence was found to suggest that Casey had been armed or had posed any immediate threat to Mark. The presence of the gun, combined with the two distinct gunshot wounds to Casey's body, suggested that the incident was far more complicated than a mere act of self-defense. If you're new here, consider subscribing for more stories like this, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us reach more viewers. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're always the first to know when we release a new case. Let's continue with the investigation into Mark Fields' tragic double life. In 2014, Mark Fields, a 38-year-old regional sales manager, married Lisa Fields, a 35-year-old elementary school teacher. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Dayton, Ohio, where they built a home and started a family. Their life seemed perfect to those who knew them. Mark's steady career in sales allowed Lisa to stay home with their children, and they quickly became the picture of suburban success. By 24, they had 2 children, ages 8 and 10, and their lives were centered around work, school, and family activities. Mark's career required frequent travel, but he made it a point to be present when he was home. Lisa, a dedicated teacher, spent her days educating young children and organizing family events during the weekends. To those outside the family, the Fields appeared as the ideal American family, reliable, hardworking, and committed to each other. They attended local community events, participated in neighborhood gatherings, and were well liked by their friends and neighbors. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, Mark had been leading a secret existence for several years. While he maintained his role as a devoted husband and father, he was also carrying on an affair with Casey Taylor, a 29-year-old woman he had met through a mutual acquaintance in 2021. Mark kept his relationship with Casey entirely separate from his family life, seeing her in secret locations, hotels, or during work trips. The affair had begun innocently enough, but it quickly escalated into a full-blown relationship. Mark kept the affair hidden from Lisa, convincing her that his late nights at work or occasional trips were just a part of his job. Casey, however, began to grow frustrated with the secrecy. She wanted more time with Mark, more public acknowledgement of their relationship. As the months passed, her demands increased, while Mark struggled to balance his 2 lives. Despite Mark's attempts to keep his family life intact, the stress of maintaining a double life began to take its toll. Lisa had noticed small signs of change in her husband. He had become more distant and preoccupied, often disappearing to work for longer periods, or refusing to discuss his schedule in detail. Lisa's suspicions grew, but she had no concrete evidence to confront him. She continued to trust him, believing that their family was as stable as it seemed. Yet, what Lisa didn't know was that the betrayal was much deeper than she imagined. Mark's actions, driven by his need to keep both worlds separate, would eventually come to a violent end. The shooting outside their home on July 18, 24, was the tragic culmination of Mark's secret life, one that would ultimately be exposed in the most shocking way. While Mark Fields maintained the appearance of a devoted husband and father, he was secretly engaged in a relationship that had begun nearly 3 years earlier. In 21, Mark, seeking companionship outside of his marriage, met 29-year-old Casey Taylor, a trans woman, through an online platform. What began as a casual encounter quickly grew into a more serious affair, one that Mark kept entirely separate from his family. Mark's wife Lisa and their children, ages 8 and 10, were none the wiser to the relationship. Mark continued to play his role as a caring father and a responsible professional. He would spend weekdays at work, attending family gatherings on weekends, and doing what appeared to be typical family activities. However, during these times, Mark was also secretly meeting with Casey at hotels or in secluded areas, far from his family's view. These encounters were often planned under the pretense of work-related obligations or late meetings. Over time, Mark's relationship with Casey deepened. While he remained committed to his family life, the affair with Casey had become an integral part of his existence. He would often find himself spending increasing amounts of time with her, either in private or over phone calls, while continuing to deceive Lisa about his whereabouts and activities. Casey, for her part, was aware of the deception but accepted it, knowing that the relationship was built on secrecy. Despite his outward commitment to Lisa and the children, Mark's time with Casey began to take priority. The affair was sustained by lies and avoidance, with both Mark and Casey keeping the relationship hidden from the outside world. Mark even went so far as to set up separate social media accounts to communicate with Casey, ensuring that Lisa would never find out. However, the secrecy of their relationship came at a price. As time passed, Casey began to grow frustrated with being kept in the shadows. She wanted more from Mark, not just his time, but a public commitment, and the absence of this left her feeling undervalued. Casey began to demand that Mark make a choice between her and his family, urging him to end his marriage and live openly with her. Mark, however, was hesitant to disrupt the family life he had built. His reluctance to take any drastic steps only increased Casey's frustration. The situation reached a boiling point as she became more insistent, putting even greater pressure on him to decide. By mid-24, the affair between Mark Fields and Casey Taylor had reached a critical juncture. Casey's frustration with being kept a secret had grown intense, and her demands on Mark became more frequent and urgent. She insisted that he either leave his wife, Lisa, and their children, or end their relationship entirely. This constant pressure weighed heavily on Mark, who had always prided himself on his family life and was unwilling to completely dismantle it. Mark's reluctance to make a decision led to a shift in his behavior. He began to distance himself from Casey, making excuses about his increasing work commitments and family obligations. The late nights and weekend absences grew more frequent, and while he tried to maintain the facade of being a responsible husband and father, his actions told a different story. He began to avoid spending time with Casey, hoping that she would lose patience and move on. But as his excuses became more frequent and less convincing, Casey grew more upset, feeling that she was being ignored and discarded. Meanwhile, Lisa, his wife, started noticing the changes in Mark. She observed his growing secrecy with his phone, his reluctance to share details about his schedule, and his increased absences from home. While Lisa couldn't pinpoint the exact cause of her concerns, she began to feel that something was off. The sense of unease in the home grew, but Lisa had no concrete evidence to confront Mark with. Despite her suspicions, she never suspected the full extent of the affair. She continued to trust her husband, assuming his behavior was merely a result of work-related stress. As Mark's emotional distance from Casey increased, his anxiety also grew. He was trapped between his two worlds, the family life he had built with Lisa and the secret relationship that had been escalating with Casey. The tension was mounting on all sides. On one hand, he had the growing pressure from Casey to choose her over his family. On the other hand, he had Lisa's increasing emotional distance, not knowing that his affair was the root cause of the growing strain in their marriage. With every passing day, the situation became more untenable, and Mark found himself facing an impossible decision that would soon lead to devastating consequences. On the evening of July 18, 24, after weeks of mounting tension, 29-year-old Casey Taylor showed up unannounced outside Mark Fields' home. She had grown increasingly frustrated with Mark's lack of commitment to their relationship, which had been kept secret for nearly 3 years. Casey was determined to confront him about his indecision, about his unwillingness to leave his wife, Lisa, and their children, and about his repeated assurances that he would eventually make a choice. Mark, who was inside the house with his wife and children, was unaware that Casey had arrived at the property. He had been home for the evening, spending time with his family as usual. However, when Casey approached the house, Mark was alerted to her presence. As she stood outside, pacing, he went out to meet her, knowing that their relationship could no longer be kept hidden. What followed was a heated confrontation. As the two exchanged words, Casey's anger over being kept in the dark for so long boiled over. She demanded to know why Mark had been lying to her, why he refused to take the next step with her. Mark, unable to deal with her frustration and the weight of the situation, became defensive. The argument quickly escalated, and Mark, feeling cornered and panicked, retrieved a gun that he had kept for personal protection. The tension of the moment triggered Mark's response. In a moment of rash decision-making, driven by anger and fear, he fired 2 shots at Casey. The first shot struck her directly in the chest, causing her to fall backward onto the lawn. The second shot grazed her arm as she attempted to move or shield herself from the attack. The sound of gunshots rang out through the quiet neighborhood, alarming nearby neighbors who immediately called 911. Within moments, the police were dispatched, and paramedics were on their way to treat Casey's critical injuries. Mark, realizing the severity of what he had just done, stood at the scene. He didn't attempt to flee or make excuses, and when officers arrived, he was quickly apprehended without incident. His actions, driven by the need to silence the confrontation, had now exposed his secret life. Inside the house, Mark's wife, Lisa, and their 2 children remained oblivious to the violence unfolding just outside their door. The reality of the situation, Mark's double life, the affair with Casey, and the shooting, would soon come crashing down on their family. What was once a quiet suburban household had now been irrevocably changed by Mark's violent outburst. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe for more gripping cases like this. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Mark's actions were impulsive, or do you believe this was a premeditated act? Hit the like button if you're still following along, and don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of this case. Let's continue to uncover the truth behind Mark Field's actions and the investigation that followed. Police arrived at the Turner residence within minutes of the 911 call, securing the area and immediately assessing the situation. Paramedics rushed Casey Taylor to the hospital with critical gunshot wounds, but despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Her injuries were severe, and the 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and one to the arm, indicated the deadly nature of the attack. Mark Fields, who had remained at the scene, was immediately arrested without resistance. He was taken into custody for questioning, where he provided a statement claiming the shooting had been an act of self-defense. He told police that the confrontation with Casey had gotten out of control and that he had fired the gun in an attempt to protect himself from her anger and frustration. However, the evidence soon began to tell a different story. Detectives on the scene recovered the firearm used in the shooting, a handgun legally registered to Mark. The weapon was found near him when the police arrived. Ballistics testing confirmed that the bullets recovered from Casey's body were consistent with the handgun, supporting the claim that the shooting was carried out using the weapon found at the scene. Digital forensics played a significant role in the investigation. Mark's phone records, along with those of Casey, revealed a long history of communication between the two. Text messages, phone calls, and location data painted a clear picture of their secret relationship. Investigators uncovered messages dating back to 2021, when the affair had begun, and spanning all the way through to the days leading up to the shooting. The text messages between Mark and Casey revealed the growing tension and frustration in their relationship, with Casey repeatedly demanding that Mark make a decision about his family life. Investigators also uncovered numerous attempts by Casey to contact Mark in the days before the shooting. She had sent multiple messages, urging him to make a choice between her and his wife. In one exchange, she threatened to expose the affair unless Mark made a commitment to her. These messages corroborated Casey's mounting frustration and her insistence that Mark make a decision, further supporting the prosecution's claim that the shooting was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but the tragic result of a confrontation driven by months of emotional manipulation and pressure. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the shooting was not an isolated incident of domestic violence. Rather, it was the violent culmination of Mark's secret life and the hidden affair with Casey, one that had been concealed for years from his wife and children. The evidence, both physical and digital, provided a clear picture of premeditated action rather than an accidental event. The case against Mark Fields was becoming stronger with each new piece of evidence uncovered. Mark Fields was arrested on the night of the shooting and initially charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter in the death of Casey Taylor. The charges were based on the evidence that Mark had intentionally shot Casey after a heated confrontation. His trial, which began in early 2025, was closely followed by the community as the case unraveled the details of his double life, a life kept hidden from his wife, Lisa, and their children for years. During the trial, the prosecution laid out a compelling case that Mark's actions were premeditated. They presented evidence of his long-standing affair with Casey, which had been ongoing for nearly 3 years. The prosecution argued that Mark had been under increasing pressure from Casey to choose between her and his family, and that he ultimately decided to silence her to protect his secret. Text messages and phone records confirmed the pattern of manipulation, with Casey's repeated demands for Mark to end his marriage and commit to her. In their closing arguments, the prosecution emphasized that Mark had the opportunity to leave the situation peacefully, but instead, he chose to escalate the conflict by retrieving a firearm, and shooting Casey twice. The defense, however, argued that the shooting had been the result of a confrontation that spiraled out of control. Mark's attorneys claimed that he had acted out of fear and frustration during a particularly volatile argument. According to the defense, Mark had not intended to kill Casey, but had been caught off guard by her demands and the intensity of the confrontation. They presented the argument that Mark, who had been under emotional and psychological strain, was unable to control his emotions when Casey confronted him. The defense sought to portray the shooting as an act of panic rather than a deliberate act of violence. Over the course of the week-long trial, both sides presented their case, and the jury deliberated for just under a day. After carefully considering the evidence, including Mark's history of secrecy and the confrontation that led to the shooting, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Mark Fields was convicted of second-degree murder, and the jury found that the circumstances surrounding the shooting met the criteria for manslaughter. The sentence was handed down shortly after the verdict. Mark was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15 years. For Lisa Fields, the verdict brought little comfort. The woman who had once believed in the man she married was now left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. With her children, Lisa was forced to come to terms with the devastating truth of her husband's betrayal, and the emotional toll of discovering his affair and his violent actions left scars that would take years to heal. Lisa filed for divorce shortly after the trial, seeking to rebuild her life and provide stability for her children. The case left the Dayton community in shock. The man many had once seen as a devoted husband, father, and respected member of the community was now exposed as someone who had been living a double life, one that led to the murder of a woman he had once promised to love. Mark Fields' actions had irrevocably altered not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. The trial served as a grim reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that the consequences of hidden lives can be far more devastating than anyone could have predicted.